It's called the Listening Post, and basically the idea was to find somewhere in the United States where we could use some of the experience we've had in other countries like South Sudan, but in a community in the U.S. that has some of the same development issues. And New Orleans is often the logical choice because, well, for a variety of reasons, but most recently Hurricane Katrina in 2006 dropped the population of the city by about 100,000 residents or more. People left, people's houses were damaged, the city was damaged, and so there's been this almost now a decade of rebuilding, but the school system basically didn't exist after the storm. Neighborhoods were broken up, so people are all over the country, and this is a very tight-knit city, so people tend to live in one place around their relatives for their whole lives, so people were displaced to other states like Texas and Arkansas and Atlanta, Georgia. So we wanted to create a project that gave people an opportunity to talk about what they were going through as they try and rebuild their city. And we wanted to work with the community radio station because just like in the south of Sudan or in other parts of the world, radio is still a really nice way to connect with communities, probably the best way, even here in New Orleans. So that's kind of the basic reason that we started this project here. And the way that we started it was with a survey, which I'm sure you guys have done many times. But basically, we wanted to ask people first, well, what's the best way to get in touch with you? If we have questions for you, if we want to pose, ideas and get your responses. So we went around the city to different kinds of events, like a farmer's market or a basketball game or a church service. And everybody filled out the same survey. And essentially it was, if I really need to get in touch with you with news about your specific community, how do I do it? And this is still a city where people share information with their neighbors. Information's passed from house to house more than it is online or even through the newspaper. So we wanted to connect with people on that level, and we came up with two ways to do that. One is on their cell phones. So about 90% of people in the U.S. now have a cell phone, and an increasing number of them have smartphones. So that came back at us from our survey as a great way to reach people. And then the second idea we had was, how can we be all over the city at once, even though we're not physically capable of it? So we built these posts. They're called listening posts, and they're like statues. They're art. We had a local artist design them. And inside of them we put a microphone and a digital recorder. And each week we put questions next to the post. And so we put them in places where people spend time and hang out. So mostly it's been libraries, but we also use the barbershop. We have a community center that we're using, and then we have a couple of these devices that we can bring to events in the city. So I'll give you an example. On Saturday, we went to the big park here where everybody's outside having a cookout, birthday parties, and we have this sculpture that's a fish. It's a big red fish. And so inside its mouth is the microphone, and in its gills is the digital recorder, and we just set it up and we hand people the questions, and they can answer however they want. But it's a way to be in people's space with them, as opposed to being a reporter and putting a microphone in their face or having them come into the studio. It's just kind of offering them their own space where they can talk about their own solutions and ideas to what's happening in the city. And for some reason, people really like talking to our fish. It's an interesting phenomenon. So we set it up and we hand them the questions, and then we kind of walk away and we let them do it themselves. And people always come back to us and they tell us that they told the fish very intimate things.
This one guy, on Saturday or Sunday when we were out there, I was just listening to the tape. This one guy kept calling him Mr. Fish. He'd be like, yeah. Well, Mr. Fish, this such and such and such. So, people talk to it like it's a character, sort of. And
we also have a lamp post, and we have a tree, and we have a totem pole, and we have an old telephone. And I think this is a very specific city with a lot of kind of creative traditions. So I think people view our sculptures as kind of part of the city, like they feel ownership of them. So we've actually been on a break for the last 6 weeks, and we're getting emails from the library. People want to know where you are. People are asking us, you know, when are you going to be on the radio again? So I feel like we've succeeded because we've created an identity. We've created something that both fits in with the city, but also like people have gotten used to seeing our sculptures. They've gotten used to getting our text messages. We have about close to 600 people who get our text messages. So what we do is every week or every other week we come up with a topic, and then we come up with 3 or 4 questions, and we share them both at our recording posts but also on people's phones. So they have 2 different ways to share with us. And then we build a radio show. It's only 5 minutes long, but it's based on, the core of it is how people responded to those questions. And then we get a local expert or the police department, the mayor, somebody to also answer those questions, so you kind of have that balance like you want in journalism. And it comes out to be a really interesting mixture of how people are feeling and how kind of the authorities or the, you know, the experts on these issues are thinking. And people really like it. And it's also conversational, you know. It's meant to sound like the city. And this is a city that's about 60% black. Traditionally, it's been more like 70%, but because of Katrina, a lot of people left. And so those aren't voices you often hear in community or public radio. So what we've been able to do is really actually reflect back to the city what it sounds like better than a lot of the media here. And that's been exciting for us. And people like that. There's a, you know, there's accents here, there's vocabulary here, and just hearing that and having something sound like, you know, the city sounds has been a real success too. I'll give you an example of like what we do in a given week. So this weekend there's a lot of violence here. There was a shooting maybe 4 blocks from my house, a drive-by shooting. They don't know who did it yet, but a group of young men shot up a porch around 8 p.m. when people were hanging out. And so there was a 34-year-old man, a 16-year-old girl were killed, and then a 2- and a 4-year-old boy, brothers, and their mother and sister were wounded and went to the hospital. And we've been kind of following the violence in the city because it's all around you. You can't, you know, escape it. It's around the corner from where I live. And so we wanted to kind of get people's voices about that. We're already thinking about doing something on safety in the city. So we got kind of our vox pop over the weekend out in the city. We went to one of the streets where there'd been a really violent episode recently, and we put our fish there, and people walking by talked to it. And then yesterday, to kind of get our more kind of expert voice, we walked over to where the shooting was, and we interviewed the next door neighbors, and that was very interesting. And, you know, we tend to ask even the experts or the authorities the same questions we ask the public. And so they kind of told us about what had happened and what they think and, you know, what their solutions are. And then we're sending out our text message today to get a few more ideas from people. And so tomorrow on the radio we'll put those 3 things together. And we're also including some comments from the mayor that I got at a press conference. So it's kind of like a deconstructed news story that's a little heavier on the public input. But it's probably more of a 50-50 balance between what the community's feeling and thinking and what kind of the city and, you know, kind of more of the authorities are saying. And I think that is a more compelling way to look at it in some ways, at least a different way, because mostly the coverage here is another person in the lower 9th Ward got shot, and that's the 82nd person this year so far, and it doesn't go much farther than that. So we like to think that we're adding some depth by bringing the community in. What are some of the things we heard, Kate?
We heard, it was interesting because in the park on Sunday we got there was a family, and then there was two women who were part of this family reunion that was happening right by where we were. And the family was they were white, and they, I think, lived somewhere in that neighborhood, which is, some parts of it are pretty affluent, and they all, were just like, oh yeah, I mean, New Orleans is a safe city. And so that was interesting. And then the two women who are black, who were part of this family reunion, who had talked about, being frustrated with the amount of violence, and for them, they were just kind of angry. And so you kind of got a sense of the two different cities that exist here. And but then the other woman, one of the women, was like, well, bad things happen here, but bad things happen everywhere. And I think we often get like a lot of like, I'm here till I die. People are very into New Orleans in general. So it's an opportunity for people to like talk about how much it means to them to live here. We get that a lot. And a guy who we talked to on the street where something really violent happened a couple of weeks ago, he said he lived in that neighborhood, and he said that the day that he bought his house, there was a dead body in the house next door. Yeah, so we get, that was just this week. Sometimes there's other pretty crazy stuff that we hear. But, he was just like, I just thought, well, I'm not going to be scared, So you kind of get stories of people facing these problems that are really common here, and then just how they deal with it. And sometimes it's productive advice, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's not, which is okay too, I think, just people, saying how they deal with it. So yeah, that was at least this time around.
How often do you hear things that you feel like you need to pass on to authorities or, other people to take certain actions?
I don't think we've had anything that alarming yet.
I think one of the reasons we get some of the comments we do is because people here have given up on the local institutions. So it's kind of like the police department is down about a quarter, if not a third, of the officers they need. The 911 call center sucks. Ambulances don't show up. Like, I think, yeah, you're talking about a city that's not as bad as Detroit, but I think that, I mean, by putting it on the radio, our hope is that it has an impact so far as, people who listen to NPR tend to be people in power. So that's one good thing about where it airs. But as far as like hearing something that we should share with the police department, I guess it feels like that's just kind of how the city operates. Like people, it doesn't faze anyone. And we haven't heard anything that was like, I feel like that we were compelled to like, as citizens, we'd have to turn over.
Yeah.
But we do hear things that blow our mind and are uncomfortable and are sad and happy, but often sad.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that one of the other journalists from Sudan was asking, if I understood him correctly, is that when you have some of these issues, it sounded like you were saying at some point that you also, that the mayor or other people of authority somehow are made aware of it, whether they are, you get their input, or there was some point where it sounded like there was some interaction as far as the broader discussion where the officials in the city actually were coming into that discussion. So
we had the district attorney on. We had one of the city council members. We worked with her twice, and she's kind of considered the city council member that everyone wants to work with.
With that, we actually asked people at our posts and in listening and in the text messages. We said, "What would you ask a city council member?" Or just like send us your questions for city council. We didn't necessarily say, and we're going to ask them, but then we ended up, taking the questions to her, and so we had this whole episode where we asked her questions that people had sent us. So that was a way to, link up people in the community with someone in power.
And, I was at this press conference yesterday about this murder, and we're friends with the communications guy for the police department, and he knows about our show, and he listens to it. And so it's also just as journalists making those kind of relationships and getting people interested in the program. And I think people do view it as something different that others haven't been doing. So I think they take it seriously. And then the last thing we do is we send out this email the day before we have a show to all of the city council members and the different departments, and we let those people know what we're talking about. But we've invited more city council members to participate, so that's certainly like an area we'd like to work more on.
When you put these installations in, what is the risk of people stealing the microphone and the recorder and that type of thing?
Kate?
We haven't had a single problem with that so far. I mean, I think it mostly depends on where you put it, right? So we put it in libraries and a community center and also a barber shop. And especially the libraries and the community center, I feel it's a space where, and it's in view of the librarians or the staff or whatever, and we haven't had any problems. So I think, I guess that's a risk technically, but if you kind of position it correctly and in the right place, I don't think it's that big of an issue, really.
Okay.
You can also hide. I mean, they're kind of hidden as well. The microphones, not as much, but the recording devices are usually kind of hidden in some part of the sculpture so people probably don't realize that there's a fairly expensive piece of equipment in there.
Yeah. Okay.
How expensive is that equipment?
The digital recorders we got are around $200, and the mic is probably $150, and that's all you need, really. We have an XLR cable, and we have these remote operational pedals, so people can operate the devices whether we're there or not. So what we did is there are these pedals that people use usually to record music, and they have a fairly long cord, and basically we fix them to the floor or the wall, and we paint one part of the pedal green and the other part red, and you hit the green to talk and the red to stop talking. And there's very specific instructions up at the post. So, I mean, we also hire interns that hang out at our posts during the week, and that's been really successful. We found that people are a little more long-winded and engaged when they have somebody physically inviting them. But the hope is that over time, the more you contribute, you just know how to do it. So basically, we trained some local kids to train the public, and that's been a really good experience for us as well.
What are the implications in terms of, as more and more people migrate towards less expensive smartphones, and people have access to NOLA.com and the famous radio stations down there and TV and so forth? How will that affect this, and are you guys trying to build up sort of brand identification?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I get text alerts from NOLA.com on my phone, but the difference is I can't respond to them, and I think there's an effect of me sending you a question and asking your opinion that's different. It's kind of like I feel like there's a relationship in that that we've created with 600 people in the city, which is really interesting. And people always can opt out of our service, so the fact that most people don't tells us something. As more people have smartphones, I think what we found is that they don't necessarily know how to use them in terms of being online. So there's like an education there that hasn't necessarily happened. And I think, it's one thing for people to go to a website on their phone, but it's another to hear that buzz in your pocket and to be reached out to personally. And I think radio has that impact too. Like you feel like somebody's talking to you directly. I feel like doing these text messages is that, and no one else is doing that so far. Mm-hmm. We're actually trying to maybe collaborate with the newspaper just because they have an audience we'd like to have. So we're interested, and we've sat down with them once, and we'd like to do it again. Yeah, just to see, because I think the more people you can get to sign up, that has a lot of data possibilities. I mean, we don't need a ton of responses for our radio show just because of the nature of its length, but I think you could do a lot more interesting work in data journalism and surveying with more people. But I do think we have an interesting cross-section just based on how we started, which was going to events around the city. Yeah, so, and you know, it's another good point, like the newspaper actually has a really shitty reputation at the moment. I mean, they went down to 3 days a week publishing, and now they're reintroducing it on Saturdays and Mondays, but just to cover the football team. And so that sends a message. I mean, it's a joke around the city. You go to the website, and it's Murders and Saints football. And there's there's very little else, I think, that people are really kind of feeling like they're getting out of that relationship. There is another newspaper here that's coming in and trying to compete, and they seem a little more news-oriented. But, yeah, I think it's that getting a message from us is a personal thing. And, I mean, who knows how long this will last? Maybe cell phones will be obsolete in a few years. I have no idea.
Well, I think what's more likely is that our platform that we use to text people would have to advance with, like, for example, the use of WhatsApp, which obviously is internet-based texting rather than SMS technology. So. And
it's free. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Like young kids here, we noticed have WhatsApp because it's free.
And just internationally, it's way, way, way more popular than SMS. Well, from what I've observed from being in other countries.
But I think what we've learned that's transferable for things that you're doing in other places, regardless of how you're reaching people on their phones, is like kind of the format that we do, which is a bit of a news headline. And so we include a link for people who do have smartphones, and then, you know, just these questions. You know, keep it short, keep it somewhat general. I think it's really, we've tested it and we feel really confident about kind of how we set that up, regardless of the platform. Not that that's rocket science and that you guys don't already do that, but yeah, I think simple is better.
Can you describe the ground source tool that you're using?
Yeah, it's a friend of mine from Minnesota created it, who has a public radio background like me, and it's, I mean, in his mind, I think it's mostly a survey tool to get data. Like, he'd be happy, as I'm sure many of you would be, if we were asking more kind of like yes or no, or kind of more quantifiable, qualitative, I mean quantitative type stuff. He'd love to do more like, you know, 1 through 5 multiple choice stuff. I think as reporters we're a little more geared towards qualitative, you know. But yeah, and so it's a platform. You log in and you have your source list. So there's 2 ways to add to your list. You can get people's numbers and their permission, and you can put them in manually, which we did at the beginning. And now we have this set up so you can just text our number, and by doing that, you become a member. And we haven't gotten to where we're collecting more data about individuals. When we did our paper survey, we got where people live and their general age. But when people just text in, we haven't really followed up yet on getting some more of those details. But you can have, yeah, you can build out a profile for people, and then there's a map, and you can put them as a pin on this map. You can see where they are, where, you know, the closest intersection to where they live, and that can enable you to just survey certain parts of the city if you need to, which we haven't really gotten to that level yet, but I can see where it would be useful. You can also choose groups by age, and I'm trying to think, oh, male, female. So you can kind of self-select who you want to talk to, and then you build your bulletin, which is what we do, or you can build a survey, which is a little bit more structured, and then you choose who you want to send that out to. And so it sends out about a text every 6 seconds, more or less. And yeah, and then people are open to respond or not. And the reason we start with a headline and a link is we want people to benefit from our interaction regardless of whether or not they respond. And then, so that comes first. Hey, this is the listening post. this is going on, like this is the topic, here's a link about it, and then a second message comes with the questions. Mm-hmm. And again, you can answer or not, or you can text the word stop. And we get about a 10% return rate, which, again, is more than enough for what we were trying to accomplish right now. And, you know, sometimes people send us really long diatribes, but we don't get, you know, I mean, when you look at a newspaper article online and you kind of get these arguments that go on forever and, you know, are just kind of like self-serving, we don't get that so much.
Right. We usually get pretty constructive or productive comments.
So that's also been really kind of enlightening for us, is we really didn't want that effect that you see on a website. And again, I wonder, my curiosity is if that's that personal relationship people feel, because it came onto their phone, they feel like you actually want to know what they think. So usually it's shorter and pretty constructive. We did something on should the city ban smoking in restaurants and bars a few weeks ago, and we got a ton of responses, mostly saying yes. But yeah, a lot of different thoughts as to why, and yeah, it was really helpful to our reporting. We're also starting to take some of that data that we get, responses, and try and incorporate them into like more traditional reporting stories through the radio station. So depending on what reporting people are working on, is there a way for us to use our cell phone system to help, you know, get some different ideas. So yeah, in a lot of ways we're really just, you know, kind of getting our legs still. Although we are out of funding, in case any of you have any ideas.
I wanted to ask you about the expansion beyond New Orleans, because I know you've also done this project in some coastal communities.
We haven't done a lot with that yet, but we got a second number that's in the more rural areas along the coast here, and the specifics of it are, you know, what people are seeing and experiencing related to coastal erosion and sea level rise, which is Louisiana has the highest rate of coastal loss in the world. And so people are literally like facing down in the next, you know, maybe even 5 to 10 years, having to move because the Gulf of Mexico is moving towards New Orleans. And so we have a small group of people. We haven't been communicating with them a lot lately, but there's a very high rate of return there because I think it's a topic that's actually really personal. Like, people are like dealing with it. And it's more focused. So yeah, it's as we kind of work on reporting in those areas and come up with questions that we have about what's happening down there, it's been really useful. Like, I can't get to all these places in a car every week, so it's a way to get some perspectives and evidence without having to actually be in front of people. And I'm looking forward to doing more of that, just because I think people take it seriously and you get some really interesting anecdotal thoughts. So yeah, and I mean, we talked to the public radio station in Miami, which is also encountering a lot of coastal issues, and they're interested in learning from us how we've been doing this project. And I also went to Birmingham, Alabama a few months ago and worked with the newspaper there about how to do this. So there's a lot of interest in, yeah, how do you create something that actually connects with the local community, and, you know, where they feel ownership of it and where they feel compelled to participate. Detroit's another place that shot us an email. Even the NPR reporter in Israel was interested in talking to us. So I think there's a lot of potential. Yeah, it seems mostly so far in the public radio universe, but.
One thing that I've learned with you guys from this project is probably just how important, how the number one, the first and foremost important thing that we're doing is engaging with the community, and how that two-way conversation that the radio station had never kind of used before has built up branding, gotten more listenership, but also really enriched the newsroom. And how it doesn't necessarily, it's not like the listening post as these funky microphones that's the solution. It's really working with the community to meet them where they are. And I think that coming at it from that angle is what will be transferable to all different local media in the U.S. and lessons we can bring to the field too. I've been talking to some folks in New Jersey who are super interested in this and feel like there's so much information out there, not enough local. And so how do we bring people into the conversation? Is it the listening post? Is it cell phones? And is it like really being mindful of multi-platform engagement?
That's good to hear. I think that's a good reminder. It's like we had our news director here kind of freaking out about covering this violence, and I had to kind of reorient her to remind her like that what we're doing, this little show and this interaction with people, is every bit as much journalism as, kind of the more mainstream stuff. In fact, more important in a way, because if you go and look at the coverage of something like this, you see very little kind of like community input. Mm-hmm. And like the same story being written over and over again. And so it was a good reminder to me of what you're saying. It's like we actually have voices about how this makes people feel and what they think we should do about it, in addition to, the mayor. So my hope is that this becomes more of a strategy of coverage as opposed to kind of an outlier of creativity, is my goal.
Totally.
Well, that's a good question. What's next? I mean, I feel like we're just really good at this right now, which is what makes me happy. Like, it took a year, but
yeah.
I feel like we can do this faster, and we have a better idea of, before we set out to gather our materials, I think we have a pretty good idea of how we're going to do it.
Yeah, and I think considering how much the project developed over the course of 1 year from when it started to where, where it is now, or where it was, in late June when we left it, I mean, it's pretty incredible. So it'd be great to see what could happen with another year. You never know. I mean, because it seems like it's always kind of like morphing, not necessarily morphing, but, developing, and new things come up. And
yeah, and the fact that people around the city are asking us where we are.
Right. We're just kind of starting to, as everyone here knows.
When the library emails you, that's when you know you've made it.
Right. You don't just show up, obviously, and everyone loves you. So we spent like a year just hitting the tip of the iceberg with that in terms of the community getting used to it. And
yeah. When we knock on your door, we're asking for something different and unique, and I think people like that. It's a little kinder than just kind of shoving a microphone in somebody's face.
One thing, Jesse, that Carolyn said, used an expression or said something. The idea of meeting people where they are, meeting a community where they are. I don't know. We talked to you about this guy that out in the West Coast, Tappan Parikh, who's at UC Berkeley and does these amazing projects around the world, in particular Labmar in India, with building up, working with local communities on finding solutions. A lot of it has to do with their data within those communities about themselves, that kind of thing. And one of the people, there was a presentation, and one of the people who was involved used the expression of meeting communities where they are. And one of the things that he said in his was, that is great to do, but what he's trying to focus on is meeting communities on where they want to be, not where they are now. And the idea, in particular, in places where there's a lot of new introduction of cell phones and the kind of technological increased access to technologies that allow them to kind of think forward. So my question is that when right now you're thinking about like kind of what's next, and I know that you do that the conversations that you're having with the community right now, or what the concerns are that the community has about what's the state of their community, from what I understand. And I'm just wondering whether or not it would be interesting, or wouldn't really change that much, I just want to hear from you, is if that were framed as to where do you want to go, or where do you think the community should be going, or is that kind of something which is already wrapped up in the dialogue that you're currently having?
I think two things. I think we include that as a question, but I like the idea that you shared in terms of just kind of being a part of the project, like, yeah, kind of getting people to think that way, I think would be really interesting. Yeah, where do they want to go? Because that I think, especially here, I think that's what's going on in this city. It's being recreated from the bottom up. So, yeah, what do people want from it? I think we get at that a little bit, but I think that could be its own category. It's a really nice thought.